we must recognize that the borders drawn decades ago no longer reflect the reality on the ground.
The country you call Iran never changed its name. You did. For more than 2,000 years, the people who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth called their land Iran. They carved it into stone. They wrote it in fire. They bled for it across 7 empires and 14 centuries of invasion, conquest, and cultural annihilation. And through every single one of those catastrophes, through Alexander the Great, through Arab armies, through Mongol hordes who burned their libraries and salted their fields, they kept calling it the same thing. Iran, land of the noble ones, the Aryan homeland, the axis around which the world turned. The name Persia was never their word. It was yours. It was the Greeks. It was the Romans. It was a label applied from outside, from people who only ever saw one province of a vast civilization and assumed that province was the whole story. So what actually happened in 1935 when the Iranian government sent a letter to the League of Nations asking foreign governments to stop calling their country Persia and start calling it Iran? That was not a renaming. That was a correction. A country refusing, after 2,000 years of patience, to be called by someone else's word. But here is where the story becomes something far darker and far stranger than a simple act of national pride. Because the man who sent that letter, Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of Iran's last dynasty, was doing it partly in admiration of Adolf Hitler. The word Iran, the ancient Aryan homeland, was being weaponized at exactly the moment the Third Reich was turning the concept of Aryan identity into the blueprint for genocide. This video is about identity, who controls it, who invented it, and who uses it as a weapon. By the end of it, you will understand that the story of how Persia became Iran is not a story about 1935 at all. It is a story that begins 3,000 years ago, runs through the collapse of every empire on Earth, and ends with a question that no one in politics today wants to answer. Before we go deep on the story of Persia becoming Iran, drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your area. And don't forget to smash that subscribe button, because this story is about to go places that will genuinely change how you see the map. To understand why the name Persia was always a lie, a comfortable, convenient Western lie, you have to go back to approximately 550 BCE to a plateau in the center of the ancient world, to a man named Cyrus. Cyrus the Great did not call himself the king of Persia. That word, that label, would have sounded strange to him, a provincial designation, like calling the king of France the king of Normandy. What Cyrus called himself was the king of Anshan, the king of the Medes, the king of Babylon, and ultimately the king of the four corners of the world. But his people, the people he unified and the identity he crystallized, had a different name for what they were and where they came from. They called themselves Irani. Their land was Iran. Their identity was woven from a linguistic and cultural root word, Aryana, that stretched back centuries before Cyrus was even born. The Greeks were the ones who named it Persia. When Greek soldiers and merchants and diplomats encountered Cyrus's empire, they landed first in the southwestern province, the region around the modern city of Shiraz, which the locals called Pars. The Greeks transliterated this into Persis, then Persia. And because the Greek world was the dominant intellectual framework of the ancient Mediterranean, and because it was Greek historians like Herodotus who wrote the histories that the Romans then copied, and because the Romans were the template for the Western world that would eventually dominate global naming conventions, the provincial Greek label stuck. Think about what this actually means. The civilization that gave the world its first declaration of human rights. The Cyrus Cylinder, the earliest document in recorded history to formally recognize the rights of conquered peoples, has been known to the Western world by the name of one of its provinces for 2.5 millennia. It is as if China had been known throughout history as Manchuria, or as if France was globally referred to as Burgundy. And the French had been politely tolerating this mislabeling for 20 centuries, because correcting powerful outsiders seemed like more trouble than it was worth. The Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus's empire, and the empire his successors Darius and Xerxes expanded into the largest political entity the ancient world had ever seen. stretched from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the Indus Valley of modern Pakistan. At its height, it encompassed somewhere between 44 and 50% of the world's total population. And from end to end of that empire, from the satraps in Egypt to the administrators on the borders of India, the official identity, the civilizational framework, the language of the imperial court was not Persian in the narrow provincial sense. It was Iranian, old Iranian. A language and a cultural system that the Greeks glimpsed from the outside and described by the name of the port through which they first entered. This matters because it reframes everything that follows. The question is not, when did Persia become Iran? The question is, when did the world finally agree to use the name that Iranians had been using all along? And the answer to that question is not 1935. The answer is that it hasn't fully happened yet. We need to stop here and correct something that almost every account of this story gets wrong. And the mistake is so embedded in how Western education presents this subject that most people absorb it as unquestioned fact. The standard version goes like this: Iran and Persia are two different names for the same country. The name was officially changed in 1935 under Reza Shah's request. And before that change, the country was universally known as Persia. Some versions of the story add a dark footnote that the change was made at the suggestion of the Nazi German ambassador to emphasize Iran's Aryan identity and align it ideologically with Hitler's Germany. Every single part of that summary is either wrong, oversimplified, or missing the most important context. Let us start with the most fundamental error, the claim that the country was universally known as Persia before 1935. This is only true from the outside. Inside the country, inside the civilization, the name was always Iran, not sometimes Iran, always Iran. The word appears in the Avesta, the sacred scripture of Zoroastrianism, which was composed somewhere between 1500 and 500 BCE, more than 2,000 years before Reza Shah was born. The Avesta describes the primordial homeland of the Iranian people as Aryanem Veja, the Aryan expanse, the Iranian cradle. This is not metaphor. This is the earliest recorded use of a word that would survive every empire, every conquest, and every attempt to erase it. The Sassanid Empire, which ruled from 224 CE to 651 CE, used the term Iran Shar, the Iranian kingdom, as its official self-designation. Sassanid kings called themselves Shahanshah Iran, King of Kings of Iran. This is inscribed in stone at Naqsh-e-Rustam, one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, where the Sassanid kings carved their victories into cliff faces above the tombs of the Achaemenid kings who had preceded them by 800 years. You can go there today and read it. Iran, not Persia, Iran. The second error in the standard story is that the 1935 request was made at the suggestion of the Nazi German ambassador. The man who actually made the suggestion was almost certainly Sayed Hassan Taqizadeh, an Iranian intellectual and statesman who was not a Nazi, who had spent years in exile in Berlin and London, and who was one of the leading figures of the Iranian nationalist movement that sought to reconnect the country with its pre-Islamic identity. The German connection is real, and it is dark, but it has been simplified into a cartoon in which Hitler's ambassador whispered into a king's ear and a country renamed itself. The reality is far more complicated, far more Iranian, and far more interesting. The third error is perhaps the deepest one. The 1935 change was not about creating or inventing an Iranian identity. It was about insisting that the outside world acknowledge an identity that had existed continuously for 3,000 years. These are not the same thing, and confusing them produces a fundamentally distorted picture of what happened and why it mattered. But here is where the story turns complicated in ways that make comfortable nationalist narratives impossible. Because the story of Iranian identity, how it was built, how it survived, and how it has been used, is not a clean story of a noble ancient people reclaiming their name. It is a story about the collision of civilizations, the survival of culture through catastrophic destruction, the transformation of identity under conquest, and ultimately, the question of what a name is actually worth, when the civilization behind it has been fundamentally changed by the forces of history. To understand that story, we have to go back further. We have to go to 651 CE, to a battlefield on the edge of a desert, to the moment when Iranian civilization faced its greatest crisis, and somehow survived it. The Arab conquest of Iran was not a conquest in the ordinary sense. It was a civilizational collision. When the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s CE, they were not simply one military power defeating another. They were the carriers of a new religion, a new language, a new script, a new cultural framework, and a new political theology that fundamentally challenged everything the Sassanid Empire had built over 4 centuries. And the Sassanid Empire, weakened by decades of catastrophic war against the Byzantine Empire, riven by internal coups and succession crises, drained of treasury and military manpower, crumbled faster than anyone on either side had expected. The decisive battle was Nahavand in 642 CE. The Sassanid army, once the most formidable military force in the region, dissolved under Arab cavalry charges using tactics and motivation that the exhausted Persian commanders had never encountered. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward through his own collapsing empire for 10 years before being assassinated by a miller in Merv, a petty local crime. An ignoble end for the last heir of a dynasty that had stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus. With his death, the Sassanid state ceased to exist. What should have happened next, by the logic of every previous conquest in history, was the disappearance of Iranian identity. This is what happened when Alexander the Great swept through 3 centuries earlier. He imposed Greek culture and language so effectively that the period is called the Hellenistic Age. This is what happened in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in dozens of other conquered civilizations. The conqueror's culture became dominant. The conquered civilization faded into a substrate, visible only in archaeology and linguistics. But Iran did something different. Iran did something that historians still argue about, because it does not fit the standard model of how conquest works. Iran absorbed the conquest, not by resisting it militarily. The military resistance was decisively defeated. Not by refusing the new religion. Zoroastrianism gradually retreated, and Islam became the dominant faith across the plateau within 2 centuries. Iran absorbed the conquest by doing something far subtler and far more durable. It made itself indispensable to the conquerors. The Arab Caliphate needed administrators. The Sassanid Empire had produced over 4 centuries one of the most sophisticated, bureaucratic, and administrative cultures in the world. Iranian scribes, Iranian scholars, Iranian court officials simply transferred their skills to the new caliphate, continued speaking and writing Persian alongside Arabic, and within 2 generations occupied the central administrative positions of the most powerful political entity on earth, the Great Abbasid Caliphate, which replaced the Umayyads in 750 CE and which is remembered as the golden age of Islamic civilization, the caliphate that built Baghdad, that translated Aristotle, that produced Avicenna and Al-Biruni, and the House of Wisdom, was staffed at every administrative level by Iranians. The Abbasid revolution that overthrew the Umayyads was itself organized and fought largely by Iranian troops and Iranian descent aristocrats from Khorasan. The Iranians had done something extraordinary. They had lost their empire and kept their civilization. But the survival of Iranian identity through the Arab conquest was not a passive process. It required something specific, something that would define Iran for the next 1,000 years, and that makes the 1935 name change look like the smallest possible footnote. It required the survival of the Persian language, and the survival of the Persian language required a poet. His name was Abul Qasim Ferdowsi. He was born around 940 CE in the region of Tus, in Khorasan, in what is now northeastern Iran. By his time, 300 years had passed since the Arab conquest. Arabic had become the dominant language of religion, of scholarship, and of the caliphate's official communications. Persian was still spoken. It had never stopped being spoken, but it had absorbed enormous quantities of Arabic vocabulary and was written in the Arabic script. Its literary tradition had been disrupted. The great epics of the Sassanid era, the oral histories of the Iranian kings, the mythological cycles that stretched back to the beginning of Iranian civilization, all of it was in danger of being lost, absorbed, or simply forgotten under the weight of 3 centuries of Arabic cultural dominance. Ferdowsi spent 35 years writing a single poem, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It runs to approximately 60,000 rhyming couplets. It is the longest poem written by a single author in the history of world literature, and it contains, from its opening lines to its closing image of Yazdegerd III fleeing through his dying empire, the entire mythological and historical narrative of Iranian civilization from the beginning of time to the end of the Sassanid dynasty. The Shahnameh is not just a poem, it is a preservation act of civilizational scale. Every hero, every king, every battle and treaty and tragedy and moment of glory that Iranian identity had accumulated over 1,000 years of recorded history. Ferdowsi put it into a form so beautiful, so perfectly structured, so memorable that it was impossible to simply let it go. A civilization that might have faded into the Islamic world the way Coptic Egyptian culture or Babylonian culture had faded before it was instead given a monument so enduring that every subsequent Iranian ruler, Arab, Turkic, Mongol, Persian, wanted to be seen as the patron of its tradition. Here is the retention hook nobody puts in the textbooks. When the Ghaznavid Sultan Mahmud, a Turkic ruler, a man whose mother tongue was not Persian, a man whose court was as much Central Asian as Iranian, heard the Shahnameh recited, he is said to have wept. He gave Ferdowsi almost nothing for it in his lifetime. The poet died in poverty, possibly in exile. But the Shahnameh survived, and in surviving it did something that no army and no political structure could have achieved. It made Persian the language of prestige, of culture, of literature, and of identity across an area stretching from Istanbul to Delhi. Iranian cultural imperialism achieved through a single poem what 500 years of military empire had failed to cement permanently. This is the first answer to the question of how Iran survived. It survived because its language became irreplaceable. The Turks who ruled it spoke Persian. The Mongols who devastated it eventually wrote their court poetry in Persian. The Mughals who conquered India carried Persian culture with them as the defining mark of sophistication. And Persian was the official language of the Mughal court until the British arrived and replaced it with English. But culture alone could not answer every crisis. And the next crisis Iran faced was not cultural. It was existential. The Mongols arrived in the 1220s. Nothing that has happened to Iran before or since compares to what the Mongol invasion did to the country. The campaigns of Genghis Khan and his successors did not conquer Iran. They processed it. They separated the population into categories of useful and non-useful, and reduced the non-useful category to rubble. Cities that had been the intellectual centers of the Islamic world, Merv, Nishapur, Balkh, cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, were emptied. The people were sorted, artisans were enslaved and taken east, scholars were sometimes spared, everyone else was killed. Irrigation systems that had taken centuries to build and that made civilization possible in an arid plateau were systematically destroyed. And the agricultural collapse that followed reduced the population of Iran by an estimated 50 to 75%. This is not a statistic. This is the near extinction of a civilization. And here is where the story turns into something that defies comprehension. After the Mongols finished destroying Iran, they became Iranian. Ghazan Khan, who became the Ilkhanate ruler of Iran in 1295, converted to Islam. He began speaking Persian. He patronized Persian art, Persian literature, Persian architecture. He commissioned Persian historians to write the history of his own dynasty. Within 2 generations of the genocide, the Mongol rulers of Iran were indistinguishable in cultural terms from their Iranian subjects. They were writing Persian poetry. They were building Persian mosques. They were absorbing, exactly as the Arab conquerors had absorbed before them, the gravitational pull of Iranian civilization. This is the pattern that defines Iranian history and that makes the 1935 name change comprehensible. Iran did not survive by defeating its conquerors. Iran survived by outlasting them, by being so culturally dense, so linguistically rich, so aesthetically sophisticated that every invader who arrived intending to replace it ended up instead becoming part of it. But outlasting conquerors is not the same as thriving. The Mongol devastation left wounds that Iran spent centuries healing. The population took centuries to recover. The agricultural system was rebuilt only partially, and into this wounded, depopulated, politically fragmented landscape in 1501 walked a teenager with red hair, green eyes, and a religious vision that would transform Iranian identity more completely than any Mongol sword had managed. His name was Ismail. He was 14 years old. He was the leader of a Sufi religious order called the Safaviya. And in 1501, at the Battle of Sharur, his forces, cavalry from the Turkic Kizilbash tribes, who followed him with near religious devotion, defeated the Akoyunlu Confederation that controlled most of Iran. Within a decade, Ismail I had unified the Iranian plateau under a single ruler for the first time in centuries. He called himself Shah of Iran. And then he did the one thing that would divide the Islamic world permanently, reshape the geopolitics of the Middle East, and create the specifically Iranian identity that exists today. He declared Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion of Iran, and made conversion mandatory for his Sunni subjects. The imposition of Shia Islam on Iran by Shah Ismail I is the pivotal moment in the entire story, the moment without which 1935 makes no sense, the moment without which modern Iran makes no sense, the moment without which the Iran-Iraq War, the Iranian Revolution, and every geopolitical conflict involving Iran today makes no sense. Before 1501, Iran was predominantly Sunni. This is a fact that surprises most people who have not studied the subject, because modern Iran is so thoroughly associated with Shia Islam that many people assume it has always been Shia. It has not. The majority of Iranians before the Safavid period followed the Sunni tradition, as did the Arab conquerors who had brought Islam to Iran in the 7th century. Shia communities existed, particularly in certain cities and among certain ethnic groups, but they were minorities. Ismail I changed this by force. He imported Shia scholars from Arab Shia communities in Lebanon and Bahrain to provide the religious infrastructure for the new state religion. He suppressed Sunni practice with violence. He required the public cursing of the first 3 caliphs, figures venerated by Sunnis, which was a direct and deliberate provocation of the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbek Khanates to the north and east. He built Shia into the architecture of the Iranian state, the Iranian legal system, the Iranian educational system, and the Iranian calendar. His reasoning was not purely theological. It was strategic and it was civilizational. By making Iran Shia, Ismail created a clear identity boundary between his kingdom and the surrounding Sunni powers. Iran was no longer simply one Muslim state among many. It was the Shia state, the defender of a particular interpretation of Islam that the Sunni Ottoman and Uzbek empires viewed as heresy. This religious differentiation created a political distinctiveness that Iran had lacked since the Arab conquest. It gave Iranians a religious identity that was specifically Iranian. Shia Islam, as practiced in Iran, developed specific rituals, specific aesthetics, specific emotional textures that became woven into Iranian culture as surely as the Persian language and the Shahnameh. The Safavid state created modern Iranian identity out of 3 components: the pre-Islamic Iranian cultural heritage preserved through the Persian language and the Shahnameh tradition, the Shia Islamic identity that distinguished Iran from its neighbors, and a political framework, the Shahanshah, the king of kings that deliberately echoed the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires. This combination, ancient Iranian civilization, Shia Islam, and the mythology of Persian imperial greatness, is the foundation of Iranian national identity that exists today. The Safavids built it over a century of state-sponsored religious transformation, artistic patronage, and military conflict. They fought 60 years of devastating wars against the Ottomans. To defend it, they created the Isfahan of Shah Abbas the Great, arguably the most beautiful capital city of the 16th century Islamic world, a testament in blue tile and geometric perfection to the wealth and aesthetic ambition of Iranian civilization at its height. But here is the thing. The The Safavids, who did more than anyone to create modern Iranian identity, were not ethnically Persian. Ismail's family was of mixed Kurdish, Azerbaijani Turkic, and possibly Greek Pontic origin. The Kizilbash warriors who built his empire were Turkic-speaking. The language of the royal court was often Azerbaijani Turkish, even as Persian remained the language of high culture. The dynasty that invented modern Iran was not, by any narrow definition, Persian, which brings us back to the name. By the time the 19th century arrived and Iran entered into its catastrophic relationship with the European imperial powers, the word Persia had become the standard Western label for the country in exactly the same way that it had always been. A designation applied from outside, from people who had learned the name from the Greeks and never updated it. British diplomats called it Persia. Russian diplomats called it Persia. The Qajar dynasty that ruled Iran through the 19th century, another Turkic dynasty, like the Safavids before them, signed treaties as the rulers of Persia, the Anglo-Persian War of 1856. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, founded in 1908 on the oil fields of Khuzestan, all of it Persia, Persia, Persia. The Iranians themselves continued to call it Iran. The Qajar dynasty's weakness in the face of British and Russian imperial pressure produced a crisis of national identity that generated the Constitutional Revolution of 1906. The first democratic revolution in the Middle East, a moment in which ordinary Iranians, in alliance with the Shia clergy and a nascent intelligentsia, forced a constitution on their king that limited royal power and established a parliament. This revolution is almost unknown in Western accounts of the period. It happened in a year when European attention was fixed on the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War and the revolutionary turbulence inside Russia. But in Iran, it was an earthquake, and its aftershocks created the intellectual framework that would produce Reza Shah 20 years later. The constitutional revolutionaries were grappling with a question that had no clean answer. What is Iran? Is it an Islamic civilization? Is it a pre-Islamic civilization that happens to be Muslim? Is it defined by its language, its territory, its monarchy, its Shia identity? The intellectuals who gathered in coffee houses and newspaper offices in Tehran in the first decade of the 20th century were arguing about Iranian nationalism in terms that drew simultaneously on German, Romantic nationalism, French Republican universalism, and a distinctly Iranian tradition of political poetry going back to the Shahnameh. And it was in this intellectual environment, not in a conversation with a Nazi diplomat, that the idea of insisting on the name Iran was born. The argument was simple and powerful. The name Persia diminishes Iran by reducing it to a province. The name Persia was imposed by foreigners who did not understand what they were looking at. The name Iran is the name that Iranians have always used, that connects the modern country to its ancient civilization, that encompasses all of the ethnic groups within the country's borders, not just the Persian speakers of the Central Plateau, but the Azeris, the Kurds, the Baluchis, the Lors, the Gilaks, the dozens of other peoples who lived within the borders of the Iranian state. This argument was not invented by Reza Shah. It predated him by decades. He simply gave it the power of a state. Reza Khan was not born into power. He was born into the lowest level of the Cossack Brigade, the Iranian military force trained by Russian officers that served as the Qajar dynasty's most effective fighting unit. He rose through that force by a combination of genuine military competence, physical presence that was, by all accounts, genuinely extraordinary. He was about 6 feet 3 inches tall in a country where the average man was considerably shorter, and a political intelligence that he concealed behind an appearance of blunt military directness. In 1921, he led a coup that put him in a position of de facto power over the Iranian military. By 1925, he had maneuvered the last Qajar king into exile, been declared Shah by a constituent assembly, and founded the Pahlavi dynasty, a dynasty named, significantly, after the Middle Persian language of the Sassanid era. He was making his dynastic intentions clear from the moment he chose his name. He was not just a new ruler, he was a new chapter in a 3,000-year story. Reza Shah's modernization program is often compared to Ataturk's transformation of Turkey, and the comparison is apt in some ways and deeply misleading in others. Like Ataturk, Reza Shah built railways, introduced Western-style legal codes, promoted secular education, and forcibly modernized the country's dress and social codes. Like Ataturk, he suppressed traditional religious authority and attempted to create a form of secular nationalism. Like Ataturk, he was authoritarian in ways that caused enormous suffering. But unlike Ataturk, Reza Shah's nationalism was backward-looking as well as forward-looking. Ataturk wanted Turkey to be new. He broke deliberately with the Ottoman past, changed the script, banned the caliphate, created an entirely new national identity grounded in a romanticized Anatolian ethnicity. Reza Shah wanted Iran to be ancient. He invested enormous resources in archaeology, in the excavation of Persepolis, in the celebration of the Achaemenid heritage, in the construction of a national identity that stretched back to Cyrus the Great. His most iconic project was the reconstruction and study of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, which he presented as proof that Iran was not a backward Eastern country in need of Western guidance, but the inheritor of one of the greatest civilizations in human history. This is the context in which the 1935 name change must be understood. Reza Shah was not adopting a German idea. He was executing an Iranian idea that had been developing for 30 years and that fit perfectly within his broader project of constructing a modern Iranian national identity grounded in ancient Iranian civilization. The letter was sent to the League of Nations and to foreign governments in December 1934, with the change taking effect on March 22, 1935. The Iranian New Year, Nowruz. The timing was not accidental. Nowruz is the pre-Islamic Iranian New Year, a festival that stretches back to Zoroastrian tradition and that Reza Shah was deliberately elevating as a marker of Iranian civilizational identity. Changing the name on Nowruz was a statement, but the Nazi connection is not imaginary and it cannot be dismissed. Reza Shah's government in the 1930s was actively cultivating a relationship with Nazi Germany. The reasons were partly strategic. Germany was neither Britain nor Russia, the two powers that had been carving up Iranian sovereignty for a century, and partly ideological. Some of the Iranian intellectuals who surrounded Reza Shah were genuinely attracted to the Nazi racial framework, because that framework appeared to elevate Aryans, and Iranians understood themselves to be Aryans, the people from whom the word derived, to a position of racial superiority. The Iranian nationalism of the 1930s absorbed, to a degree that is uncomfortable to acknowledge, some of the toxins of European racial nationalism. The celebration of pre-Islamic Iranian identity sometimes shaded into a denigration of the Arab conquest and an anti-Arab sentiment that had political uses both domestically and diplomatically. The German ambassador to Iran in the 1930s, Heinrich Friedrich Karl von Etzdorf, did reportedly encourage the Iranian government's interest in emphasizing the Aryan dimension of Iranian identity. This is real. But to say that the name change was a Nazi idea executed at German suggestion is to strip Iranian nationalism of its own intellectual history, its own 30-year tradition of debate, its own internal logic. It is, in a smaller way, exactly the same intellectual error as calling the country Persia in the first place, reducing a complex, internally generated Iranian phenomenon to something that happened because of what outsiders did. Not everyone accepted the change immediately, and the resistance from the Western side is revealing in its own right. The British Foreign Office debated the request at length. Part of the resistance was simple institutional inertia. Every map, every file, every commercial treaty referred to Persia. But part of it was something subtler and more telling. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which controlled the enormous oil fields of Khuzestan on terms that gave Iran a fraction of the profits, had a name that would have to change. And there was a feeling, not always stated explicitly, that acceding to the Iranian demand was somehow dignifying a government that Britain regarded as difficult and unpredictable. The British eventually complied. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1935. It would remain Anglo-Iranian until 1954, when, after Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry and the CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup that overthrew him and restored the Shah to power, it was reconstituted as British Petroleum. The story of Iran's name runs straight through the story of its oil, because both stories are about who has the right to define what Iran is and who its resources belong to. In 1959, Reza Shah's son and successor, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, issued a clarification saying that both names, Iran and Persia, were officially acceptable for use by foreigners. This clarification was widely misinterpreted as a reversal of the 1935 change, but it was not. It was an acknowledgement that the cultural associations of the name Persia, Persian carpets, Persian poetry, Persian cuisine, had a commercial and cultural value that Iran was willing to claim alongside its official name. A Persian carpet sounds more romantic than an Iranian carpet. Persian poetry sounds more ancient and refined than Iranian poetry. Iran was not surrendering the argument it had won in 1935. It was acknowledging that identity is not just political. It is also commercial, aesthetic, and emotional. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 added another layer of complexity that the 1935 nationalists could not have foreseen. The revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini was explicitly anti-nationalist in its ideology. Khomeini was hostile to the pre-Islamic celebration of Iranian identity, to Nowruz, to Persepolis, to the whole apparatus of Reza Shah's and Mohammad Reza Shah's Achaemenid mythology. He saw nationalism as a tool of imperialism, a way of dividing the Muslim world along ethnic lines to prevent Islamic solidarity. The revolution he led was not an Iranian revolution in the ethnic national sense. It was an Islamic revolution that happened to be based in Iran, and yet the revolution, despite its anti-nationalist ideology, kept the name Iran. It kept Nowruz. It kept the Persian language. It kept the administrative structure of the Iranian state. It kept, in other words, the civilizational substrate that 3,000 years of Iranian identity had built. Because you cannot simply replace a civilization by changing its political system. You can change who runs the government. You can change the laws. You can change the flags and the anthems and the school curricula. But you cannot change the language a people dream in, or the poems they memorize as children, or the festival they have been celebrating at the spring equinox since before the birth of Muhammad. The Islamic Republic of Iran is, in this sense, both a repudiation of Iranian nationalism and its latest expression. It is a country that defines itself by reference to Islam and simultaneously produces more translations of ancient Persian poetry than any other country on earth. It is a state that officially celebrates the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution and simultaneously closes schools and government offices on Nowruz. It is a civilization that has been arguing with itself about what it is for 3,000 years and has still not stopped. So what is the real answer to the question this video started with? How did Persia become Iran? The answer is that it didn't. Iran was always Iran. The country that Alexander the Great invaded, that the Arab armies conquered, that the Mongols devastated, that Ferdowsi preserved in 60,000 couplets, that Shah Ismail converted to Shia Islam, that Reza Shah modernized at gunpoint, that the Islamic Revolution transformed. Through all of it, from before the birth of Cyrus to after the death of Khomeini, the people who lived there called their home Iran. What changed in 1935 was that the world was finally asked, officially and through diplomatic channels, to use the name that had always been the correct one. And the world's resistance to that request, the British hesitation, the commercial complication, the Nazi association that provided convenient cover for dismissing the demand, tells you something important about how power works and whose names get to be used. The name Persia was never neutral. It was a convenience for people who did not feel obligated to understand what they were looking at. It reduced a civilization of profound complexity, a civilization that had survived Alexander, the Arabs, the Mongols, and the British, to a province, to a rug, to a cat. It was comfortable. It was easy. It carried the scent of an exotic East that the Western world could admire from a distance without having to take seriously. The name Iran is not comfortable or easy. In the 21st century, it comes loaded with nuclear negotiations and theocratic governance and geopolitical tension and the specific anxiety that the Western world has felt about this particular country since 1979. It does not evoke poetry and carpets and miniature paintings. It evokes news cycles and sanctions and conflict. But here is what the news cycles and sanctions miss, what the geopolitical anxiety obscures, what gets lost every time the conversation turns to missiles and centrifuges. Inside the country that the world calls Iran, there are 85 million people who are the inheritors of the most tenacious civilizational tradition on earth. A tradition that has survived conquest and conversion and colonialism and revolution. A tradition that was already ancient when Rome was founded. A tradition whose poets are still memorized, whose architects still humble visitors, whose cuisine still defines a region, whose mathematicians and physicians and astronomers were the hinge on which the transmission of Greek knowledge to the European Renaissance turned. They call their home Iran. They always have. The question, the uncomfortable, important, politically charged question, is not what to call the country. The question is whether the world is finally willing to see what the name has always contained. Cyrus the Great issued the first declaration of human rights in recorded history. He freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, an event recorded in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Ezra. He is the only non-Jewish figure in the Hebrew scriptures to be given the title Messiah. The civilization he founded was, at its moment of greatest power, the most tolerant and diverse political entity on earth. And the civilization that descends from his, that carries his name in its ancient form, that has been building and being destroyed and building again for 3,000 years, that civilization is still here, still arguing, still producing poetry and mathematics and political theology and popular protests that shake the world. History doesn't remember what it decides to call a place. History remembers what the people who lived there decided to do with their time on earth. The Iranians chose to survive. That is the story no one told you.